Good morning, and welcome to the second day of the 2024 Norwich University Military Writers Symposium. Thank you to everyone who joined us for yesterday's panels and discussions, and we are looking forward to another insightful day. For those who were not able to join us yesterday, this year's topic is titled Perception Wars, the Battle to Control Reality. This morning's first panel is titled Safeguarding the Role of Media in Democracy, and I am one of your two moderators, Hector Aponte. I'm a political science major, and my co-moderator is Cadet Daniel Ingley, who is also a political science major. We know that this topic is of interest, considering how much media has evolved in our lifetimes and how much media plays a role in politics and elections in our country, especially with the presidential election less than 1 month away.
With that said, we are excited to be joined by this panel's presenter, Dr. Zizi Papacharoussi. Dr. Zizi Papacharoussi is a UIC Distinguished Professor of Communication and Political Science at the University of Illinois and Department Head of Communication. She is also a university scholar and an affiliate faculty with the Discovery Partners Institute at the University of Illinois System. Her work focuses on the social and political consequences of online media. She has published 10 books and over 80 journal articles and book chapters. Zizi is the founding and current editor of the open access journal Social Media and Society. She has collaborated with Apple, Facebook, Microsoft, Tencent, and Oculus, and has participated in closed consultations with the Obama 2012 election campaign. She sits on the Committee of Health and Well-Being of Young Adults, funded by the National Academies of Science, the National Research Council, and the Institute of Medicine in the U.S. And she has been invited to lecture about her work on social media in several universities and research institutes in Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas. Her work has also been translated into Greek, German, Korean, Chinese, Hungarian, Italian, Turkish, and Persian. Her latest book, titled After Democracy, Imagining Our Political Future, is out now from the Yale University Press. She is presently working on 2 new books on connective AI and digital media and democracy. Thank you for joining us, and we're incredibly grateful to have you with us.
Good morning, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here. I have to confess, I was low-key excited when I received this invitation. And then ever since, every interaction that I've had with my moderators and then with all of you has really heightened that excitement. Thank you for the opportunity to be here, be part of this, to share some of my thoughts and my research findings with you. There we go. My work focuses on the social and political consequences of media, the internet, social media, AI. I'm very interested in the role that media play in democracies and non-democracies, democracies in transition, democracies in disarray, and democracies in general. The topic of our panel is safeguarding the media in democracies. So I'm going to start by answering that question right away and say the media are okay. We do not need to safeguard the media. They're doing just fine. It's democracy that we need to pay attention to. Our media were created to run as a business with democracy as an afterthought. And many of our social media platforms were created with the same motivation in mind, to work to generate profit with democracy as an afterthought. So what we have to focus on more is cultivating a social conscience among our journalists, our news media, our social media, and put democracy at the center. So today I'll be talking about I'll start by talking about what social media do and do not do, how they work. And by social media, I broadly refer to platforms that run on the internet, but also a variety of AI apps and modalities that are coming into prevalence. So I'll start by talking about what media do and do not do, how they play a part in democratic processes and what sort of impact they have on contemporary civic landscapes. And then I'll transition into talking about how we feel about all of this and what can be done about it. So let's begin with some fundamentals. What does the internet do? Does it inherently democratize? Thank you. It does not. The internet is not a magical space. It cannot create something out of nothing. It cannot put into place something that did not previously exist. Social media cannot come in and take away democracy, nor can they install democracy. That's really not how things work. The internet doesn't possess some kind of magical wand that can help make these things happen. Nor does the internet inherently democratize. What it does is it pluralizes. It offers more pathways for connection and expression. These pathways, these avenues, can connect democratically oriented people. They can also connect fascists. Nor does the internet extinguish, or any of the platforms that it facilitates, nor does it extinguish social problems. It didn't create hate speech. We brought that with us. But what it does do is it amplifies hate speech. It makes it much more visible. That's generally what the internet does. It amplifies communication. It makes voices that already existed much more vocal, louder, but it doesn't inherently do so on equal terms. All voices are equal. Some voices are more equal than others online. So you're probably thinking, well, if it doesn't do all of these things, what exactly is it responsible for? And I would say, quoting Melvin Kranzberg, as I did in yesterday's discussion, technology is not good nor bad, nor is it neutral. It does shape in subtle ways the texture of interactions that we have, and I'll talk more about that next. Do social media make or break elections? No, they do not. They do not tell us what to do. We're not automatons. We're not going to read something on a platform or hear it on the news and then decide that immediately we're going to need to take that specific course of action. That's really not how our cognitive, attitudinal, and behavioral mechanisms work. But what does happen is that news media and social media tell us what to think about. So they focus our attention on very specific things. So think about, every time you're paying attention or too much attention to a single current event, what else is going on that you're not looking at much more closely? In some ways, we might say that, social media, news media, they zoom in or they set the agenda. What I'm quoting here is from a very popular, very established theory of political science communication that's called agenda setting. So news media, social media, they tell us what to think about, and then they also tell us how to think about it. And by that I mean they give us language, phraseology, ways to think about and organize the various things that we see in our heads. Do they make or they break revolutions? No. But through the way in which they operate, they intensify movements, often by accelerating communication of a populist nature that tends to polarize. But there are some things in our systems, again, that are built to sustain and encourage that polarization. I'll talk about those in a minute. Social media also connect and divide, and they often do so at the same time. They connect us on some issues, and then at the same time, they divide us on others. And they enable acts of symbolic impact. And this is important to emphasize because all too often we're swayed by the virality with which information moves online. And we assume that change is going to follow at an equally fast pace. And when it doesn't, we're disappointed. But it's not our media necessarily that let us down. It's our own expectations. It's our media institutions in general, ones that have been existing, have been with us for a very long time. And it's also the fact that we have to remember that change is gradual and revolutions are long, and they have to be long in order to attain meaning. Now, I'll talk a little bit more about specifically how social media and news media frame current events in ways that make them susceptible to disinformation attacks, render these events disinformation targets. And then also I'll talk about how we use social media in ways that render us vulnerable to the same disinformation threats. How exactly does this happen? It happens in a variety of ways. I just have 30 minutes, and I have two moderators who want to hear about a number of different things that I focused on. So I'll just talk about those two things, and I'm happy to answer more questions about further detail and offer further detail. The first way in which social media, and again, you have to keep in mind that a lot, where most of the information that we see on social media originates in news media. So news media present the world to us, a world that is very large and we cannot directly experience through framing. They create frames, much like a photographer does. They create lenses, and through these lenses, they help us focus on particular aspects of an issue that they deem are important. They do so through language use, so very subtle language choices that we often tend to disregard or to just kind of, readily incorporate into our everyday routine of talking about events. Those matter. Those are small indicators of bias that end up, seeping their way into our everyday realities, being reinforced and then also reproduced as we use them more and more. Examples, that you may have seen recently in the press, uses describing an assassination attempt as an attempted assassination, an alleged assassination, or just plainly an assassination attempt, talking about Joe Biden as dropping out of the race versus withdrawing from the race or stepping out of the race. Those are very, very small, subtle changes, but they create impressions and they carry a slant that appeals to particular audiences. The most striking use of language that we study in political science and communication and social psychology has to do with the manner in which elections are covered. And I would say, it's striking that we've been saying this and studying it and documenting it for about 100 years, but still nothing has changed. The most striking example is the fact that in the United States in particular, elections tend to be covered as horse races, using a lot of metaphors from sports. And that's done in order to capture eyeballs, in order to elevate drama. But it also ends up, it's describing a democratic process, as a spectator sport is not a very good thing for democracy. So talking about an election as a horse race, describing it as, it used to be a marathon, now it's a sprint. Who's going to get to the finish line first? These are all things that infuse elements of drama into our everyday civic processes, but also into how we as citizens learn to think about these processes and learn to respond to these processes. They infuse it with a lot of intensity. How are things framed? What defines how things will be framed? News values, the things that journalists prioritize, that define what we're going to cover, how it's going to be covered, and when. Dominant news values are the following. Things that are closer to you tend to be covered the most. Things that are perceived to be most relevant to us also tend to be covered the most. Things that have a human interest aspect appeal also. And finally, most definitely, things that have drama associated with them. And with the advent of social media, we're seeing much more emphasis on drama and ways to capture eyeballs in a manner that facilitates and further drives and accelerates the attention economy. Because if news media were about drama, social media are 10 times that. Obviously, now, it goes without saying that all of this creates a lot of intensity in how news is presented, how news is relayed. What are some examples of that intensity? The news scroller that you see on your TV sets, but also on your screens that relay your everyday news feeds. Imagine what your news environment, what your infoscape would look like if that news scroller that is constantly moving, that's repeating the same news over and over again, creating the illusion that something new is happening, often advertised as breaking news, when in fact it's just really repeating something that was reported just 5 minutes ago or even yesterday. So imagine what your news environment would look like if that news scroller were to somehow disappear. That's what I mean when I say imagine that environment without that intensity. And now think that there was a time when we had a news environment like that. The news scroller was not always there. People who are my age will remember that it appeared and introduced the stock market mentality and rhythm to news storytelling post 9/11. There's a good reason to put it there. There's no good reason to not have removed it after. It's radically changed the pace and the rhythm of storytelling, and it's taken us away from, what we professors call slow news, a form of news that citizens find much more relatable, and they often turn to podcasts because they look for that form of storytelling that helps them understand and make their own sense, find their own place in events that are currently unfolding in the world. How do we feel that intensity as we process the news? In our panel yesterday, Nina said something interesting. She said, if you're feeling that, your emotions are aroused, that means that you're most likely being manipulated. That's exactly how we feel it. I wouldn't say emotion, but if you're feeling some kind of sensation, some kind of feeling that you're not really quite sure how to describe, some type of intensity, then that means that you're being manipulated, or there's an attempt to manipulate your affective mechanisms, your cognitive mechanisms, and then your attitudes and your behavioral reactions in some way. In science, we call that affect. In plain terms, we call it sentiment, mood, feeling. Feeling is not the same thing as emotion. Affect is not the same thing as emotion. It is the intensity with which we feel. So an affective reaction is, for example, when you start humming along to a song. Doesn't necessarily mean that you like that song. I can hum along to Sweet Caroline. I don't like that song, but it's a very hummable song. Or you start tapping your foot to music, or you nod along to conversation. You're not indicating agreement. You're just showing that you're listening, you're present, you're paying attention. Affect, this kind of intensity is often expressed in gestural ways. And I'll give you some examples to show you how that variation in intensity can produce different results, because then that translates into how our social media feeds work, how they manipulate that intensity, and then how we experience that inside. So think of a simple gesture. Think of the difference between me lightly tapping you on the shoulder versus placing my hand on your shoulder versus pushing you versus shoving you to the ground. Right? Same gesture, different intensity. It reflects a very different intentionality, and it also produces very different results. Another very striking example, think about a caress to the face versus a slap to the face, right? Exactly the same gesture, different intensity, reveals a different motivation and a completely different result. This is what media do. Using framing mechanisms, using news values, they turn events into stories. And through social media mechanisms, those stories attain even greater intensity because social media feeds work in ways that are repetitive, are very rhythmic, utilize refrains, and almost just sort of, lull you into a state of attention, semi-attention, that makes you very vulnerable to and very prone to clicking that share button just because it's there. Now, and again, think of what that whole environment would look like if that design element was not present, if it was a little bit more difficult for you to share, or if there was a design element that worked like, a stop sign when we drive, that just prompts you to stop and think before you cross the street or you drive across. So it's those little subtle changes in design that have to do with the intensity with which we interact in our everyday environments. So from here, I'm going to transition into something that my moderators were inherently very drawn to when I brought it up. I've been studying how social media and news media work for a very long time. And at some point, and I've been also very interested in technology and how technology impacts democracy. And at some point I said, that's enough. I want to flip the question. Let me not ask what technology is doing to democracy. Let me just ask about democracy. Let me just have conversations with people and see how they feel about all of this. And the driver behind this was this thought. A lot of people read, see the title After Democracy, and they think that I'm writing about some kind of, dystopic future where democracy doesn't exist, but that was not the inspiration for the book. The inspiration for the book was watching politicians who had very new ideas function in a system that had very old habits and very old structures, and being very confined by that system. And it also came from my students, watching young people who had very bright ideas and an appetite for civic engagement, for participation, get trapped in pathways for engagement that felt very formulaic. So I thought, what if we need a reboot? What if we're running a very old version of democracy? What if we're running version 1.0? And somewhere out there's like 2.0 and 3.0, and we just haven't really discovered it yet because we've just been so caught up in idealizing our old ways and also feeling very nostalgic about a past, a glorious civic past that we think we had but never actually really truly existed. And, what if there's something out there, maybe it's called democracy, maybe it's called something else, and it's better than democracy, and we can use technology not to push away from it, but to get closer to it in the same way that we use technology to build railways that helped us access places that we couldn't get to before. So I decided to travel the world and have conversations with strangers and approach people who were as different from me as they could be, and ask them all the same three questions. What is democracy? What does it mean to be a citizen? And what would make democracy better? I had a very ambitious plan. I wanted to travel to 100 countries. And then I went to my publisher with that plan, who sent my plan to reviewers, who said that's, really that's really a terrible idea, Zizi. That's really not focused enough. You need to be much more organized. And I was a little bit disappointed, but then I also thought, fine, I'll just, you're just making my job easier. I'll work with a smaller list of countries, and I'll also find ways to speak to people who come from countries where it's very difficult for me to travel now. And it's also, traveling there and speaking to them would put them in a dangerous position. So these are some of the places I visited, and also some of the countries that my conversational companions came from. Some were going through political turmoil, so I found myself going to refugee centers to speak with them. I'm going to go over some of the most striking responses that I got, especially when I asked the question, what is democracy? So Umair from Pakistan told me, is to speak up when something is wrong. Hussein from Afghanistan said, democracy is not the same as politics. And here I was struck because, I was talking to people, the ordinary citizens who had so many different things to worry about, including their safety, where they're going to be alive in the next hour. But they had the patience to give me such deep statements that, democracy is different from politics, that reads like Hannah Arendt. And this person did, but this person did not go to university. And I'm not sure if they will be able to go to university. Citizen used to be a privilege. Now it's a label. You elected them, it's your choice. Protest about the important things, not just about everything. Those who govern us must have an education. Governance is not for everyone. We must raise the standards. We all want to be heard, but we must learn to listen to each other. And, this is basically the pathway out of polarization in one sentence. Luis, Mexico, this was my first interview that I did on a very warm city, on a very warm day in Mexico City, and Luis was my taxi driver. On cover, democracy, but it doesn't feel like it. Must balance emotion with logic to be a good citizen. Democracy depends on what government does with it. And this, I think, will resonate with many of us. People often have to choose the least worst option. So these are some of the things that bring us together when we think about the troubles of democracy. It's interesting, when I started talking to people, at first they would give me textbook definitions of democracy. And often they would say, did I get it right? And I would explain, there's no right answer, and I had some prompts that I used to get them to give me examples of, what democracy might feel like, or what was a situation that they participated that felt particularly infused, with democratic elements. But what it boiled down was this, most of my conversational companions, my informants, believe that the current version of democracy feels dated. We have grown out of established paths to civic participation, and trying to go down these paths still feels like, I say in the book, like trying to get into the clothes that we wore as teenagers. So we can feel that energy, that affect of that age, of that time in our lives, but it's obviously something that we cannot bring back. I'm going to wrap things up with what I ended up doing in the book in the end. So I really wanted to talk talk with people about, again, what might follow democracy. I'm still very interested. Is there something better out there? But my conversational companions were just so caught up in the old structures that it was very difficult for them to imagine different ways of doing, different ways of being. So I tried speaking with them about, things that they enjoy doing and recreating those in some ways. And I weaved the stories together to call 10 recommendations, 10 things that need to happen in order for us to get to the point where we can liberate our imaginations, where we can think, where we can begin to think about new things. So I'll go over the 10 things quickly and talk a little bit more about number 9, reinventing journalism. But before I go over them, I want to clarify that I'm not saying that one of these things would fix the problem. All 10 of these things apply together, and possibly a few more that I'm sure many of you have ideas about, and many of the participants and speakers in the conference have actually written about. So number 1, reverse the trend. We live in societies that are dominated by strong capitalism, soft democracy. Reverse that out. Softer capitalism, not doing away with capitalism. Softer capitalism, stronger democracies. And by the way, hostile actors, potential enemies, are aware of this weakness. There's someone like me, or many people like me, on the other side who are pointing these things out. Our media system is vulnerable because it has an extremely capitalist foundation. And that's the part of it that's being exploited. Sure, there's a lot of open doors, that can be mended through coding, but there's some systemic flaws that have to do with the very, business-oriented manner in which our media work, and it's going to take some work to mend those. Micro-governance, most of my participants were very excited about community work that they did. So we need to find some way to reintegrate that into the everyday processes of democracies, reward it and recognize it. Counting absence. We can't just ignore the fact, that 50% of the population doesn't vote. It does not mean that they're apathetic, and it does not mean that they're not interested. We have many studies that show that. It means that they don't see anything that represents them, and they're feeling counted, but they don't feel like they count. Long and short-term politics is a simple thing that we do in our family planning. We plan for the short term, we plan for the long term. Yet when politicians run for office, they often confuse the two, or they don't link them properly. Beyond voting, so creating avenues of participation beyond the sort of, 4-year, every 5-year, depending where you live, exercise, where you go through this ritual of casting your vote, and then, politicians forget about you until it's time to summon you to the polls and the voting booths again. A civic education for all of us and our politicians. Forgetting messiahs. I think this is very important. Learning to distrust people who appear, sometimes out of nowhere, and promise that they can magically solve our problems and offer very vague responses to that. We need to remember to question that. We learn to do that in college. We offer a very good education in this country. We somehow neglect to do that post-college. Gaming the system. News media headlines, economics of attention, citizens of the present, of the future. Your attention is your power. How you direct your gaze matters. Choosing to pay attention to something makes it important. Ignoring it takes away from that importance. Be very mindful about the things that you choose to pay attention to, and be very aware about what you're ignoring when you elect to direct your attention to a particular event. Be your own agents of civic change. And so lastly, what I want to emphasize what I'm talking about when I say reinventing journalism, there's an element of both sidism to current coverage that's especially damaging to how we understand politics, how we understand the news environment, and it also makes us very vulnerable to disinformation attacks. So you have to understand that when these messages are crafted, they're not crafted just for any system. They're crafted for our system in particular, and they're also crafted, they're micro-targeted for very particular populations. But they're crafted for a system that understands objectivity as something that contains two sides. And that's quite simply incorrect. There's very few stories in real life that, in our everyday lives, that have just two sides. Most things, there's some things that just have one side to it, and that's called the truth. There's other stories that are much more complex, and they have a variety of different sides to them, definitely more than two. Joshua Hamilton is a political scientist, communication scholar at Stanford. He wrote this very interesting book called Democracy's Detectives. And in it, he calls for journalists to be exactly that. And I'm going to completely grossly simplify his argument and say, think about what detectives do. They don't look for the two sides of the story. They look, when they're trying to figure out what truly happened, they look for all the different pieces of the story, all the different pieces of the puzzle that put together the truth. He's calling for journalists to do more of that, and so am I. And scientists, we have a lot to learn from journalists about how to present our work in relatable ways. But I would say journalists have a lot to learn from us about practices of truth finding, because we're trained in science to be objective about how we analyze our findings, and also when we're not able to be objective, to acknowledge our bias and talk about how it influences our findings, or to make our positionality a strength and explain how it enhances our perspective. So now I'm going to leave you with some quotes from the book that capture both the state of democracy and democracies that we find ourselves in, the number of different problems that we have to encounter, how we might think about finding our way out of it. This is a painting by Wilfredo Lam, and it's called Enigmatic Jungle, which is how I frequently felt when I delved into the field. Perhaps democracy is constantly about disorder and tumult and does not necessarily provide a way out of these conditions. We think of democracy about something peaceful. Perhaps it's not about that. It's about silence, noise, and constant ambivalence, what I call democracy's fugitive soul. Democracy on the run, or fugitive democracy. Democracy is not a boxing match. No winners and losers. There is consensus that implies compromise, and that is the driver of democracy. Silence is an opinion. It is a political stance. The absence of opinion, in fact, is an expression of a political position. It communicates refusal, discontent, indignation, and indecision. Silence, in many cases, is as important as voice. It's a mix of nostalgia that drives many of our expectations, but also restricts them, confines them. I frequently find myself, have very lively personalities and imaginations, but they're called to participate and engage with democracy through pathways that feel very boring and formulaic. So let's evolve out of those binaries that often inadvertently reproduce and reinforce polarization. We look for politicians who are trustworthy and reliable, but we forget that we have created a media environment that requires politicians to play a part in order to appear to be themselves. Your attention, citizens, is a powerful commodity. It's your path to agency. Choose how you use it, how you focus it. And finally, we use democratic models that do not fit our times. Feels like struggling, to fit into clothes that we wore as teenagers. Let's grow out of that tendency and feel comfortable in the clothes that we're wearing now. In our times, let's be civic adults. And remember that technologies network us, they identify us, and they also potentially divide us. But it is our stories that connect us. And those same stories will also identify us and sometimes divide us. So let's try to focus and pay attention to and reproduce the stories that will bring us together and help us mend those polarization gaps. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Papatrisi. So we will now move into a period of questions that Cadet Aingley and I formulated based on Dr. Papatrisi's most recent book, After Democracy, as she noted. And we will also encourage the audience, if you have any questions, to now begin moving to the 2 microphones on either end of the auditorium. And we will also get a chance to give you the opportunity to ask more questions. So, Cadet Aingley?
So the first question that I have for you is, in your book you talk about like the invisible citizen. So how does that notion of the invisible citizen in a media-saturated society influence how citizens perceive their own contributions to democracy?
I talk about the invisible citizen because there's a lot of research that documents disengagement and a tendency that's frequently interpreted as apathy among contemporary citizens. And we often tend to dismiss that and not discuss it further, thus rendering that point of view invisible. So we assume that just because people are not participating, they don't have a voice, they don't have an opinion, they don't have a stake. Citizens that are invisible to us are citizens that are, as I mentioned, being counted, but in polls, as undecideds or, not voting, but they don't feel that they count enough in order to make that engagement. Now, how is that reflected in our social media feeds? How does that resurface in our civic environment? I think it creates, it creates a civic environment that, and it fosters a civic environment that has not fully reached its potential. We're leaving out about 50% of the population that could have very bright ideas about what we might do for democracy, but we haven't created a space for them to contribute, to be part of what we do. And social media don't do that either. There used to be a time, I would say, in the very early days, when some of these platforms were not fully commercialized, where they, these served as places where people ordinarily marginalized or left out of conventional channels of communication could get together and share their points of view. But these days we're seeing that those groups tend to be exploited, they tend to be tapped into by politicians, and it's really where not, the 50% that doesn't make it to the voting booth on election day in most countries around the world resides.
Thank you. As I mentioned, if there's any audience questions, please feel free to move down to the microphones and ask those questions. But I'll ask another question, and I believe you alluded to it in your presentation, and it's the idea of what is democracy? And I'm wondering if you think that the United States, both in political parties and politicians, as well as citizens, have conflicting views on what democracy is, and how we define it and how we use it to kind of shape our political behavior. And if there are conflicting ideas and definitions, how do we go about mending those and kind of reshaping our understanding of democracy?
They do, and it's striking because we shouldn't. It's really a simple thing, and it's been reiterated so many times. The French says, égalité, fraternité, or sororité, and liberté. So it is about, equality, togetherness, and liberty. But it's not. It's about all of those three things together, all the time, for everyone. So it's not, about liberty for and just liberty. It's liberty and togetherness, which means embracing people who are different from you and offering the same amount of liberty that you enjoy to them as well. It is about freedom, yes, but it's not about all the freedom in the world. It's about freedom that also respects the rights of others. So I think, there's a very common misconception that is tapped into by political messiahs who exploit it and turn it into populist refrains that, democracy is about free speech. Yes, it is about free speech, but let's examine why, free speech was put into place to safeguard the rights of others. So that, there is this misconception that, democracy is about unregulated freedom, and that is exploited in populist rhetoric. But it is not. Democracy is not about that. It's about consensus. It's about agreement on how much freedom we're all going to have and what we're going to do to protect each other and ensure that we all enjoy the same kind of freedom and the same kind of access. If you want all the freedom in the world, don't live in a democracy. Go live out in the mountains somewhere, or go create an authoritarian state for yourself.
Thank you. We'll start questions over here.
Hello, my name is Cadet Bellinger. My question was, how do we incentivize media to prioritize democracy and to prioritize like a more democratic approach to, I guess, storytelling, essentially?
Yeah, that's a $1 million question, a $1 billion question, and it also can be a very long conversation. But I'm just going to give a couple very simple responses, and then maybe we can talk about it some more after the talk. I'll give you some examples. Well, the first thing to remember is that in the United States, the news media is a business, and social media are a business as well. Social media in particular are a very curious kind of business because many of the platforms, don't produce a product, and we often say if you're not really sure, what product is being produced, then you are the product. And yes, that is part of it. We are producing. We are the content farm that drives Facebook and supports Facebook. But there's also a machine that's supported by stock market economics that further supports many of these companies. The driver and their motivation for their existence is profit making, and democracy is often an afterthought. There's a lot of elements that could go into the design of a platform that could ascertain that the platform imparts a set of shared social values. And that's a direction that we're taking in the academy and that we're also discussing with policymakers as a very promising future pathway. The idea that, we can't move forward and create social media that do not share a set of commonly held social values. Alondra Nelson is running a new lab out of the Princeton Center for Advanced Study that's specifically focused on that, and she formerly used to work with the Biden administration as chief technology advisor. Another pathway is working with algorithmic audits to ensure, again, that the algorithms that many of these different platforms are being used or drive how content is curated, rather, on these platforms adhere to specific standards. That's an interesting solution. I don't think it can be 100% effective. But I think we have to look at how these companies begin. And we have to remember that as societies, we idealize these people who dropped out of college to start these companies, and we're enamored by that. We think, oh my God, Zuckerberg dropped out of Harvard and started Facebook, and now he's a billionaire. And Musk, took some time to finish college, and look what he's doing now. But we have to remember, keep in mind, perhaps it's not so good that a person who didn't finish college got to start a company that's so influential in our everyday lives. because Zuckerberg didn't take that class on disinformation that all of you took in high school and in college. He didn't take classes in the humanities about social justice. So he doesn't know a lot of the things that all you know about these kinds of inequalities, and is not fully aware of how some of these things are reproduced and reinforced. I said yesterday, the response has to be tripart, regulatory, so we have to get companies to commit to thinking about democracy not as an afterthought, but at the center of what they do. The second thing is design elements, so designing for democracy. And there's many recommendations. We've been working, scientists have been working on this for a while, so there's a wealth of recommendations in terms of what we can do. And then the third one is, our own behaviors, how we use those platforms. Be much more critical about how we engage. I think, we learn a lot of very interesting things in the classroom, and then, we get caught up in the everyday rhythm of things, and we forget about them. Thank you.
Morning, doctor. Morning, panelists. My name is Angie. I'm currently studying the linguistics of marketing, and I really, really resonated with what you said about it is all about the delivery. It can create divides that we didn't even think could be created. And so my question to you is, with the rise of new media, podcasts, new social media platforms, how have you observed the divide in the intensity that you described?
Podcasts are interesting because they've been around for some time, and I think they've captivated popular interest because they practice a slower form of news storytelling, and because there's not like a ticker, or a clock. There's not the necessity to produce a soundbite. They're a little bit like a contemporary version of talk radio. People can listen to them as they're driving or as they're multitasking. Or, they're a contemporary version of radio, actually. So there's a way in which we tune into them that allows us to multitask and also listen to a form of storytelling that affords nuance. So that's a good thing. But, there's a but there in the sense, as they grow in popularity, they're being exploited, they're being commercialized. So most likely, we'll start seeing more and more podcasts that tend to conform to popular ways or popular forms of storytelling that are commodified, that will tend to go after more sensational ways of coverage to attract eyeballs, and we'll start to grow out of that initial form that we found as listeners so captivating for its intimacy and for the authenticity that it promised. And no doubt, I think we'll see they are already vulnerable to disinformation attacks. I talked a little bit yesterday about influencers, of course, being a big part of the disinformation story. I think in the future we'll see virtual influencers taking on that role and confusing us even further. I'll just finish by saying there's a very interesting phenomenon, with one of my doctoral advisees. We studied female MAGA influencers. And we looked at a variety of things. We looked at the language that they use, but we also looked at a variety of activities that they have. Did they have an Instagram profile? Did they also have a podcast? How did they present themselves? How did they introduce themselves? What sort of background did they use? What did they talk about? And we've been doing that for the past 2 years. And they have some catchphrases or some slogans that they use that are designed, they're things that really resonate with the MAGA public. They're designed to draw in those followers, and they're often, translate into hashtags that then bring in more eyeballs and greater traffic. But the interesting thing that happens is ideologically, they're not necessarily aligned with MAGA. They're using that affiliation in order to transition to the political center. And once they transition to the center effectively, they start to disavow some of those connections and present a more mainstream persona. But in the meantime, the damage has been done. So I think that's a very interesting trend. It's not entirely new. We saw it a little bit with the abortion rights and opposition to abortion rights movement. It's a popular strategy that Phyllis Schlafly adopted. She was, much more extreme in her political positions, and she moved to the center. She started to, and a lot of politicians, of course, as they move to the center, they tone down. But what these influencers are doing is they're really just, drawing on keywords that are particularly appealing to a MAGA crowd and exploiting people that, some often don't realize that they're being exploited for their own political advancement.
My name is Cadet Clapp, and my question is a two-part question, which is, when interviewing those who came from countries with non-democratic regimes, was democracy something that they desired/favored? And was the type of democracy that they desired the same as the one we have in the U.S. or something different?
Yeah. So, this is a question that I got when I was starting to put together. A lot of people thought that I should not interview people from non-democratic regimes. And I responded and said, everybody has a right to democracy. And, when we try to imagine what a better democracy might look like, I think we need to have a conversation with everyone and not really just sort of, prioritize our idea of democracy or the kind of democracy that we want to export to the rest of the world. When I interviewed people from other countries, they were very sweet and moving mix of skeptical and cynical and hopeful, but also disappointed and disillusioned at the same time. And they were not too different from the people that I interviewed in the U.S. or in other countries that we think are closer to the form of democracy that we practice in our own world. Running the project, and I think this was one of the most compelling things. It really helped me realize, and I hope it's conveying to the rest of the world, that we're a lot more aligned than we think when we talk about what is important to us when we think about democracy. So there was not too much difference. Sure, there was difference in, do you run elections, like in the details. Do you run elections every 5 years? Do you have a parliament? Do you have a presidential democracy? People talk, is there a royal family in the mix? People will talk about those things, but they didn't come up in conversation more often. Once people got beyond those very textbooky definitions that they gave me of democracy, they talked about things that we do in our communities that were deeply moving and really revolved about very common things that had to do with, again, this idea of togetherness, this idea that, I'm not going to keep all the rights for myself. The point, we created democracy so that we can exist together in a way that supports all of us. So it was I don't know if it was, I wouldn't say that it was a surprise. I wouldn't say that I expected anything different, but it was a deeply, touching experience to interview people who fled Afghanistan because they were being recruited by the Taliban. And if they stayed, they would have to join the Taliban. And if they didn't join the Taliban, their family was going to get killed. So they just fled, with the clothes on their back. And I'm walking in there and asking them, what is democracy? And they give me this very rich insight that, they say, well, it's something very different than politics. And politics doesn't necessarily always guarantee democracy. So I would say more common things with our form of democracy than not, but also they're very aware of the limitations of our system in the U.S. And interested in ways of coming up with ways of doing democracy that serve their own cultural context better.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you. Oh, thank you, Professor. I was also had a question about autocratic societies. I was wondering through your research what you learned about what does civic participation look like in an autocratic country?
Yeah, so, there's a variety of different viewpoints. I'll talk about the interviews that I did in Russia and China. So in Russia, I think we have the assumption, correct me if I'm wrong, that, there's a lot of people who are constrained by Putin. That's actually not the case. There's a lot of people who are age maybe like 40 to 70 who remember what it was like to live in the 1990s, remember the economic insecurity, the lack of safety, and they just kind of look at Putin as a messiah who saved them from all of that. So they're, they understand, they would like to be a little bit, Russia is just sort of like a very esoteric insular democracy. They would like to be a little bit more extrovert about, their diplomatic relations, but they don't necessarily want to, they're worried, that if Putin left, they would go back into that chaos. And then there's, younger people who are obviously bothered by that and would like to just live in a world and live in a country that is just much more engaged with the rest of the world in a way that doesn't necessitate always military action. The responses that I got when I asked about democracy, they were filled with, cynicism and skepticism that I also encountered in, societies that we consider much more democratic, but at the same time, were going through their own travails with polarization. China was another very interesting series of interviews. There I felt like, the farther I got from the system, the easier it was for people to talk about how disappointed they were in autocratic regimes. But many of their concerns had to do with economic insecurity and the system not providing equal opportunities for all. As I interviewed people who had slightly more white-collar jobs, people talked more about their own sense of responsibility and what they should be doing to contribute to a better society, and why some things are not just, the fault of the leadership, but also their own fault for not doing better, which is not an uncommon thing to encounter when running interviews in that area, although, one should be careful to not generalize too much because it's a very vast country with many different areas that have their own traditions and approaches. I hope this clarifies.
Thank you.
Good morning, ma'am. I'm Cadet DeMeyer. On the same topic of authoritarianism, part of the perception battle is trying to explain to our own citizens why we should continue to be a democracy when other international systems, such as the later forms of authoritarianism in Singapore or the stronger versions of authoritarianism in countries like China, appear to be a lot better to citizens possibly in the West who are disenfranchised with democracy. How can we try to protect those democratic institutions from backsliding against those tides?
I don't, it's a very complicated question. I think our approach has to be very careful. I mean, for many decades, we have allowed a sense of American exceptionalism to drive the way that we think about the rest of the world. So we assume that we have an ideal way of governance. We try to export a brand of democracy to the rest of the world. We assume that we have an ideal set of democratic values. We try to export that. We forget that other countries have longer histories with democracy than we have, and they've gone through turmoil that we haven't encountered. And perhaps because they've gone through that turmoil, because they've gone through civil wars that are more recent, they're also a little bit more resilient. So we often, it's very tempting for us and very generous to think that we can step in and save and help others. But I would recommend that we just kind of flip the question around and see what we can learn from those countries that have been in turmoil. And I remember a few years ago when President Trump was elected, so many people were unfriending previous friends on Facebook, and they were worried about going to Thanksgiving dinner and getting into arguments with their families, and they had difficulty. I mean, they just didn't have a code of conduct for that in their civic vocabulary, which was interesting to me because I'm Greek. I grew up in when I was born, there was a dictatorship in my country, but, quickly, thankfully, only for 7 years, and we switched back to a democratic system. I grew up in an environment where, for family gatherings, on holidays, there were fierce arguments and, tables and chairs being thrown around and people walking out of the room, and then like an hour later, we just came in and hugged it out. So, in some ways, we're very experienced in a society, as a society in the U.S., and we have a lot to offer in terms of guidance. But there's also a lot that we don't know about how to mend polarization, how to live with polarization first, so as to understand it, so as to study it, so as to figure out the mechanisms that reinforce it. And I'll tell you one of them, there's a fundamental flaw in our political system in the sense that we have two parties, and they're described as the left and the right. And immediately that creates a very linear political binary that exists between two poles. So we've already, founded our political system with a very strong potential for polarization. We've created the poles. So one idea is to remove those extreme poles, because again, nothing exists in linear, physics. If you study, nothing works in linear fashion. Most political positions, do not reside between A and B. They reside all over the place, and most folks have some positions that are a little bit on the left and a little bit on the right. I hope this gives you, I don't know if it answers your question, but I hope it gives you interesting things to think about.
Good morning. Given some of the comments that you have made, as well as comments from yesterday's talks, I have a contention I would want to get your opinion on, and possibly the two students as well being more in tone with what's going on in our current generation. But when it comes to perception wars, Russian disinformation, these various outside influences trying to change how people are looking at things, my impression is that ultimately the onus isn't on any of these outside factors. Those are kind of catalysts. Those aren't really by themselves impactful. No one's going to wake up one day, read that, and then change their mind.
Right.
What ultimately is the driving force behind all this is, pardon me, is domestic politics and people in America, for example, feeling angry at the current political system or feeling isolated or feeling like the powers that be are against them. They then see some of these articles or they hear an influencer or what have you, and they think, the current system is not working for me. These people seem to hold me in contempt. They don't respect me. I have not been able to convince them otherwise, so you know what, I'm going to throw in my lot with this crowd or that crowd or what have you, because I don't have faith in my system, because they have shown that they're not going to work with me, they're not going to respect me as an equal, which is simply to say that these are all symptoms of politicians failing to actually take care of Americans as a whole, but instead playing tribalism with, oh, I like you, you've said the right things during this culture war thing, so I'm going to back you instead.
Right. I agree. You know, I mean, this thing started, you know, these tendencies and tensions have a very long history. You know, there's a very famous sociologist, anthropologist, Arlie Hochschild. She infiltrated a community in the South because she wanted to study the origins. She wanted to study the Tea Party. And she ended up stumbling into sort of the birth of the MAGA movement. She wrote this wonderful book that's called Strangers in Their Own Land. And she described many of the emotions that you were referring to. Again, this feeling of alienation, this feeling that this is my country, but I'm not getting the opportunities that I deserve. I'm being ignored. You know, I'm only paid attention to when it's election time, and then people forget about me. So that's very much at the root of this. You know, that's a vulnerability in our system. So many of the disinformation attacks that we see, those are the systemic vulnerabilities that they target. You know, as I mentioned in the beginning, yes, you know, they're looking to get them through some sort of, you know, trapdoor that Facebook has left open, or, you know, something, you know, something that you're sharing on TikTok that makes it into Facebook. But ultimately, it speaks to people because of those deeply felt insecurities. And here's what it does. You also mentioned this. It doesn't lead to behavioral change. Mediated content cannot do that on its own. You know, behavioral change takes a long time to occur. When we think about how we affect change in the behavioral sciences, first we want to create this intensity that, you know, that I talked about. So we want to get your attention. You know, we want to get you excited about the possibility of change. And then we want to link that somehow to an attitude that we want to gear you towards. And that's the foundation of marketing, advertising, also the foundation of, you know, perception wars, disinformation strategy. And over time, with prolonged exposure and in concert with a whole network of agents in your community who are also supporting the same ideas, then we can see lasting attitudinal change that may eventually lead to behavioral change. But you know, it's inaccurate to assume that that people view a message and they're automatically convinced. You know, people are targeting folks who already are vulnerable, who have been exposed, and who live in communities that will support those kinds of messages. So I agree with everything that you've said, and I think it forms the basis for a very interesting conversation about how these things work.
Thank you, ma'am.
So unfortunately, we are out of time. So if you'd like to sit down and we can take your question after the panel. But we'd just like to thank you for coming and spending time and insight. Thank you as well to the audience. We hope you guys can join us for the next discussion at 11, and that's going to center around weaponizing perception in communities. It's a researcher's perspective and toolkit. So thank you guys very much.